Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through how I made this epic candy corn set. So let's go. Now, if you've been around a minute and you've watched my tutorials before, this is going to be a little different. I think I made in all like 27 different designs for this set, and I want to try talking through an entire tutorial, and 27 designs is a very, very long tutorial. So what I've done here is there are a couple of designs I'm not sharing. I've cut out any of the repeat stuff too, because since it's a lot of candy corn, there's a lot of repeat motions and repeat decorating going on. So yeah, because I just want to talk about what's relevant. So let's go. First up, now this is the most traditional candy corn, or one of the most traditional. And you can see here I am outlining each section with a soft peak. This is extra, okay? This is extra. You do not have to outline all of the sections of the right color. You could just outline the whole thing in white, say, for example, and you'll see that later. But this is the next level decorating, okay? And the reason that I did this is because after this is flooded, when you pick it up and you look at it from the side, it will have the corresponding correct color as the outline to the flood. Sometimes too, if you use a different color to outline, depending on how thick your outline is and how like comfortable you are flooding all the way to the edge, then you might see the outline peeking through. For me, it really just shows on the side. But I wanted to be extra. So here we are. I don't do this for all of the cookies, just the ones I felt like it was really necessary or useful. So that's this one here. And I believe what I'm doing first is flooding in sections. I did the traditional candy corn two ways. I flooded in sections, and then I just flooded the whole thing as like a wet on wet. The flooding in sections, so you do alternating sections, you let those crust. Is that what I did here? Yes. Okay. You can see my edit there. So the white and the yellow have crusted, and now I'm going in with the orange up next to it, and this will give definition in between the sections. It's a really simple technique, but it doesn't mean it's easy. It's simple, but it doesn't mean it's easy. It is hard to execute. Getting that seam to look just right took me years. I find the way I'm doing it right here is the best way to do it, is to actually flood up against the seam. You don't want to get too close to the seam with your Scribe, because it will really mess up the beautiful seam. Unless right here, like, unless you have to actually use the Scribe to get the icing closer, try not to use your Scribe if you can. So this here is a soft peak black, and I'm just doing these cute little eyes. Give a little jiggle jiggle with my Scribe to help it settle. And I'm gonna pop some highlights in the eyes or eyeballs or whatever these are while it's still wet. This is also a soft peak. I think, yeah, this is soft peak. You don't have to use a flood for this kind of thing. You can just use a soft peak piping consistency. That's the beauty of it, and it will not crater. Yay. And then I think I'm going to add a little smiley face. There we go. Ain't she cute? Putting faces on candy corn, not a new thing in the cookie world. I just had to jump on the bandwagon, obviously, because it's so cute. Oh my god. All right. So next up, we are doing a black outline, okay? So I believe, is this? Okay, this must be also the flooded in sections, but with a black outline. So what I'm using here is actually flood consistency. I find if you're doing an exposed outline like this, it's easier to do it with a flood consistency, because it will kind of like get wider it will be a wider outline than if you did a piping. I mean, if you used piping, you'd have to like cut a really big tip in the bag for the equivalent. Now, I thought I would be able to do this just like this. So only do the black outline and then flood up next to it. And that would be it. But as you'll see by the end of this, I hid the outline too much and I did not like the look of it. So I ended up adding an outline on top of it. So when I look at myself here now, what could I have done differently? I think I could have flooded a little bit less up next to the outline. That probably would have helped here. Ugh. So I'm so bummed this didn't work. I've done this kind of technique before, not with sections like this, just with flooding the entire cookie, and it worked. So I don't know, maybe I got a little overzealous with how much icing I used. The consistencies of my icing. So my outlines are all soft peak piping consistency, except for this, obviously, I said is my flood consistency that I use for the rest of the set. The flooding, the yellow, the orange, and the white, is all my thin-ish flood. I had wanted to go for extra thin because I did have some fun with a bunch of wet on wet later. And as you'll see when we get to the wet on wet, it was not an extra thin flood because it started to crust by the time I got to doing the Scribe pulls. So, oh well. Let's see. Maybe what I coulda shoulda done was to actually do like 2 layers of the outline before I flooded the sections. Maybe that would have helped. But ship sailed. I had to use the Scribe to get into the corners, which probably didn't help either. And now it crusts. See, look, it just did not do it for me. So I'm going in with, this is the soft peak. This is not the flood again. And you can see I very intentionally started at one of the intersections with the horizontal lines, so as best to mask the start and the end of my line. So just a little tip there. Whenever possible, if I can find a way to mask the start and the end of like a continuous line like this, I will. So I still think this looks good, but it kind of defeats the purpose of spending that time to flood the yellow, orange, and white in sections. I see people do this all the time, and I'm like, what was the point of flooding in sections? So if you're going to put an outline on top of the flood, you might as well just flood the whole thing as a whole wet on wet. There's a little difference in definition. All right, so moving on to the next one. I actually don't know. I think I know which one this is. But since I started so like half of the set like this, I don't know what it's gonna be. I think I know. Pardon the yawns. Let's see. Okay, right. But what I did want to say, so this is the same start as the first cookie, but for this one, we are just going to do a wet on wet situation. But I still think it's worth it for this one to flood in the different color, or to outline in the different colors. But again, not necessary. You can totally just outline in one color. All right. Now, the way I'm joining these sections together is that line that I just put down. That's like outline consistency or thickness, not consistency. And I put that actually just overlapping the very edge of that yellow. to make sure I get the best seam possible. So instead of putting it like next to the color, like right up next to it, I find dropping the line just on the edge of the previous color gets you the best seam. So that is what I've done, and I will continue to do for the white coming up next. This is the kind of situation where people would be terrified of color bleed. Actually, there are plenty of moments later that could have color bleed. I rarely ever get color bleed for two reasons, I think. Number one, the most important is not to oversaturate your colors. You have to let your colors develop. I usually mix my colors the night before, the day before I'm going to use them, to a few shades lighter than I ultimately need. And then the next morning, they're usually where I need them, but if they're not quite dark enough, I'll add more then. So that's tip number one. Tip number two. Because when you add too much food coloring, that's really the problem. There will be color bleed. Excuse me. And what's the other thing? Oh, it will dry funny. It will not dry correctly. So just keep that in mind. And second thing is I do add white food coloring to my white icing. I didn't always do this though, and I haven't had color bleed issues in many, many, many years. So I think it's really more about not oversaturating. That's my opinion. But also keep in mind that I do work with a lemon juice recipe, so I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I don't know. Here we've got another variation of cute little faces on candy corn. And this is another thing I did not come up with. This is a design that's pretty common. And that's to put a cute little candy corn on the candy corn. So what a lot of people do with this design is they actually place a real candy corn on the cookie. And you can do that two ways. You could place it while the icing is still wet. You would need to know at that very moment exactly where you want it. Or you could place it after the base layer is dry, and then you could just attach it with icing. Me personally, I didn't have candy corn on hand, but I tend to be more of like an icing purist. So like I don't like to use fondant or other stuff. Like I just like to do everything with royal icing. So that right there was a little pressure piped candy corn situation with a soft peak. Again, we are seeing the soft peak coming in handy, my friends. And right here, I probably should have waited until that candy corn was dry until I put the little arms next to it, but since it was a soft peak piping consistency, it was okay. All right, moving on to the next one. So this was done the same, outlined the same, flooded the same as the previous one, but now we're just adding a different detail on top. So I love continuous lines, and this was my version of a continuous line on this shape. So keys here to piping beautiful lines. First of all, make sure you've got good positioning, hand or arm braced on the edge of the table or elbow on the table. You want to have a steady hand, so if you need to brace your piping hand with your other hand, you can do that with your pointer finger and middle finger on the palm of your hand. And then you need to lift the bag off the cookie. That probably started at closer to an inch, but it got pretty closer, maybe more like a quarter of an inch towards the end. And you really want to guide the icing. You are guiding the icing to the next spot. You're like laying it down. So you're always keeping your eyes ahead of the icing. Here's another example of starting the exact same and just finishing it off differently with some different line work. And same deal. So it's really, the key is to lift your bag up. If you feel out of control, it's very possible you'll feel out of control no matter what when you first start doing this, because it's oh, it's challenging, but make sure you've got everything in place, like your arm is braced on the table. If your hand is extra shaky, using your other hand to brace it. And the other key is making sure you're applying consistent pressure on the bag based on the thickness of the icing and the size of the tip of your bag. If you get any line breaks, that can happen for two reasons. Either because there are air bubbles in the icing, which you can massage out before you open the bag or before you start using it. And then it can also happen because you're not applying consistent pressure. Okay. Other important thing, make sure you breathe. I know it sounds kind of funny, but like, make sure you breathe. Sometimes I find myself like not breathing, which is obviously not good. So satisfying to watch this. I just eye all of my line placement. But certainly if you need any help, you could mark it ahead of time, say with like an edible marker at the start at the end or something like that. It'd be a little challenging to make sure you're hiding the marker. But you know, I always just divide space. Well, not always, clearly. I just did 2 lines in between these sections, so that's not really dividing in half and half, but the sentiment. There we go, another variation. Alrighty, what have we got next? Okay, this looks like one of the black base cookies. So I'm just outlining here with a soft peak. Now, I know what you're thinking. Black Grace, really? Well, this was the 4th color I decided to add to this set. It just felt appropriate. And I mean, would I really enjoy eating this? I don't know. But because it will turn your mouth kind of like bluish purple. But I don't know, it looks pretty. So I went with it. In terms of black, it is critical that you do not oversaturate your black, and that's super easy to do. Black, red, sometimes brown too. Those really saturated colors are hard to not oversaturate. And the key here, like I mentioned, let your icing sit overnight. Even with black, if you can let it sit for like 2 days, if you're really unsure about how much to color it, that would be great. I would say general rule of thumb with any color, but especially like black and red, if it is exactly the color you want it to be in the bowl before you put it in the bag, you have gone too far. It will continue to darken out of the bowl in the bag as it's drying. So with black, I always say color it to a very dark gray in the bowl. A very, very dark gray, like on the verge of black, but not black yet. And that will eventually, by the time it dries, it will be black. Trust the process. And you know what? Even if it ends up just being an extremely dark gray and not black, like, you're going to be so much more grateful for that than color bleed from the black or super crumbly, yucky texture. If you're using a vanilla recipe, it will definitely taste bitter from the food coloring. I use lemon juice, which is definitely a positive here because you can't taste when there's too much icing or too much food coloring. So just keep that in mind. Now let's talk about this plaid. Really important when doing line work like this, like overlapping lines, that you do soft peak so it kind of settles into each other. I find if you use like a medium peak, it will kind of sit on top of each other too much. And if you've ever tried to package cookies that have a lot of like overlapping line work, if they're sitting on top of each other, it's going to be super easy to like crush them and dye in the bag, basically. If I'm making any sense here, just trust me on this one. Just had a little boo-boo there. I had a line break. I'm not really sure if that was an air bubble or what, but you could see I did my best to fix it there. Employing all of my line work finesse here. I do find, so when I finish my lines, I can cut them off kind of with the bag on the edge of the cookie. So usually with the starts of my lines, I like to use a Scribe to actually like cut off the line. We'll see if I do that here. I probably will later. Well, you saw me do that at the beginning. So I find one of the keys to success with plaid is to make sure that especially if you're doing like multiple overlaps like this, that there's enough space in between each design. And so making sure that like the yellow and the orange are tight enough together so that visually it looks good with the added white. I did another variation on this you might have seen in the overall pictures, where that center design, the lines were not close enough together. And so when I tried to add the equivalent of like this white, it just looked too busy. Actually, you can see it on the left of that picture. So this here did the same deal. Started with outlining in black, flooded in black. It's still wet, and I moved immediately to do this wet on wet plaid. Yay. I don't know so I will say in terms of wet on wet lines, in a way it's definitely harder because you're using a flood consistency, right? Like this is all flood consistency and it comes out of the bag so much faster. It's definitely harder to control. Faux shizzle. But it's so satisfying to watch those lines melt into the base. Yes, please. Yes, please. Love it. And this is one of those moments where most people would be terrified of color bleed, but I didn't get any color bleed with this. Amazeballs. Simple but effective design. I'm a fan. Yay. All right, what's up next? Let's see. Ooh, okay. This might actually be my favorite design in the entire set. I had this idea, this image of doing a candy corn cutout. So, we are starting with this medium peak piping consistency. You could do this with a soft peak too. I don't know that it really matters. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I haven't done a lot of cutouts like this, but it just felt right to do medium. So I'm using this bench scraper and just smoothing that out. And it's actually okay, see here, to like go over it again. You'll lose some of the definition of the separation between the colors, which I was totally fine with. But just keep that in mind. And then I just happened to have a smaller candy corn cutter that was perfect size to mark out the shape here. So that icing had like decently crusted, which is why I was able to then press into it with that cookie cutter. So satisfying. Okay. We are, it's important that you let that base dry almost completely. Just keep that in mind. And then we're going in with the black outline. I didn't really know how I was going to finish this off. You'll see how I finished it. I thought I was just going to do this plain back black border, but you'll see when we get to it, something's missing. So I think, let's see if I can tell by the edit. Okay, I did let the outline crust ever so slightly. I do recommend letting it dry. I did have a moment, the moment I started flooding this, I was like, oh, I probably should have done a squiggle to prevent craters. But I think in the end, it actually ended up being fine. I just find it so satisfying to watch black flooding. Anyone else? Just me? It just... I much prefer to watch flooding of darker colors. I just find it so satisfying. Okay. So the only thing I can nitpick at this point is I do wish that the white tip was a little bit bigger. But it still looks good. Am I right? I am right. Okay. And I'm crazy, apparently. That's fine. We good. Okay. So I looked at this and I was like, this needs something. And then I decided to add this line work on top, and I am obsessed with it with the line work. So I'm still lifting my bag. It's hard to tell because these lines are so short, but I swear I am lifting it. It's amazing. I really was like, ooh, do I take the line all the way? It was just above that curve. And then I also really wasn't sure if I should keep the lines straight at the bottom. Obviously decided to keep them straight. Voila. Okay, here you go. You can see I'm just kind of like cutting off the end to kind of make it like a seamless waterfall off the edge of the cookie. Only do this when your piping is still wet. If it has started to crust, it will be kind of a messy clean, or what am I trying to say? A messy cut off the edge, if that makes sense. So I love this line work for a few different reasons. Number one, it just looks super cool. And number two, it distracts from any like lumpiness in the black flood. I don't know why this is, but I find, and I don't think I'm the only one, I find it very hard to get a really smooth, flat black flood. It just seems to be lumpy for whatever reason. I don't know why. Yeah, just something I've noticed. This is my PME scribe. I always have 3 scribes when I decorate. This is the smallest one. This is what I always use for this technique, or this like cleanup here. I have a medium size, like standard metal scribe. It's my favorite one from Borderlands Bakery, but they don't sell them anymore. So sad. And then, the third one is my thingamajiggy. It's called a thingamajiggy. It's that pink plastic one that, I don't know if I use it in this set at all, but you'll see it often. It's thicker. It's the thickest of all of them. It has its purpose. It's my favorite one to use if I'm ever like scraping off excess from the side of a cookie. It also has the flat tool on the top, which is what I like to use to scrape a cookie if I'm ever doing that. All right, this technique here, one of my favorites. Yes, one of my favorites. What am I trying to say? Okay, focus, Grace. So this is a medium peak. And I'm using an offset spatula here. But you can totally use a kitchen knife. I like the offset spatula because it's a small one, by the way. It's not a big one. It's one of the small ones. I like it because it has a nice, really rounded, kind of wide edge to it. So it really like flattens out the dots. I like the look of that. But the first time I ever did this, if you saw my Christmas tree set from 2 years ago, I think, I used a kitchen knife because I didn't have a small offset spatula. Just like a cutlery knife, as long as it has a rounded end to it. So I like to taper these dots if I can. So I did 5 in the first row, 4 in the second row, 3 in the third row. We're going to do, I would assume, 2 for the next one. Oh no, I'm going for 3 again. JK. Oh, right. That's because I wanted to have 2 rows of white. I probably could have spaced the first 2 yellow a little bit closer together and that first orange, but YOLO. Getting that white in there. It's important to clean off the spatula or knife after every pull. It'll get a little messy on the pulls if you don't. And I'm pulling from like 1/3 down, and you're actually pulling towards the cookie. So you touch the cookie when you finish it. And then the best part of this is the edible glitter. This is the Sugar Art Master Elite in white diamond, the diamond dust. I have white, I have gold, and I think I might have rose gold. They have a bajillion other colors. I personally don't think that the other colors are necessary or even look good. I use the white on like 99% of applications. I've even used it on black. Like, it looks good on everything. It just is a prism of light. I don't know how to describe it, but it looks really good. So, oh, right. Next one. I was like, what are we talking about next? The cookie right in front of me. Okay, this is another technique that I like to do for my shape series sets. Oh, by the way, I have not talked about what a shape series set is if you're new to the party here. This is kind of a series of sorts that I've started a couple of years ago with that Christmas tree set, where I take one shape and maybe a variation on it, or just one, like a different size or a slightly different, like with the tree I did 2 slightly different trees and a limited color palette, and then I just let my imagination flow, and I do whatever comes to mind. And it's my favorite because as an artist I give myself permission to fail. So there are always duds from the set. They used to never make it on camera. Now I've slowly started filming them and making sure they're there, partly because I often only do 1 cookie of every design in a set, which is a little bonkers. I think I used to do 2, but I do so many designs in a set that I was just like, no more. So you can see we skipped ahead here. So let me actually talk about this technique. This is called the sweater technique, the knitting technique, and you want to use a medium peak. So same one as the offset spatula, which, by the way, I do the offset spatula as the very last cookie in the set so that I can open up the tip really big, because that's a very large tip you're using. Okay, so medium peak for this, and it's this teardrop motion over and over again. You're piping a dot. As you pull away from the dot, you release pressure and pull towards the cookie. So actually kind of like a super mini version of the offset spatula, except you're not using a spatula, you're just using your hand. This is a type of pressure piping, so you're varying the pressure on the bag as you're piping. It is way harder than it looks, but once you learn it, it's so versatile, and you can use it for a lot of different stuff. Sometimes I just do like a little heart accent on a cookie, and that's basically the same thing, just like 2 pressure piped dot things. Just took a sip of water. Okay, this next design is another one of my favorites to do in a shape series, and I'm pretty sure I've done it on probably every single one. It just works so well. So I usually, I was going to say I usually prefer to use a medium peak. I don't know that it really matters. The medium peak I think is better because it gives you more texture. which when I'm doing this, I am actually going for as much texture as I can. I really have too much icing on this brush right now, so I just clean that off. And then moving on to the next one. This cutter, by the way, is from Night Owl Icing. It's linked in the description. I want to say it's the 3.5. Don't quote me on that. Check the description. They have it in a ton of different sizes. It is such a versatile shape. It's the same shape that I used for the watermelon, and I hope to use it for many more designs to come. We shall see. I think it's such a good kind of lesson to learn, to know that you can make an entire set out of one shape. You don't have to have a whole bunch of different cookie cutters. If you've watched my Halloween set, that's just a bunch of circles. I do have a Christmas set coming that is just a bunch of circles. Yeah, it's a powerful learning moment, because this kind of cookie decorating easily becomes quite an investment. So it's good to find ways to make it less of an investment, I guess. So just finishing this off, I do like to, so I start by making sure I get the full color, and then I do try to like blend the sections together. I film on a very like smooth surface, so this is always a little challenging to try to like hold the cookie but not have my hand in the way. Alright, I think we're done now. Yes. And of course, one must add edible glitter. I kind of wish I had added it to the what's it called? The knit technique one, because it just adds the best little sparkle, but I did not. Alright, this one, I sped ahead here. So we just outlined and flooded with white. And here, I've tried this technique in a few different shape series, and it has never worked out, and I think it finally did here. This is the bear technique, so I'm using, I don't know if I'm using a flood here or it's the soft peak. Let me see. When I add the orange, I can tell by the line what it is. This is called the bear technique because I think it's like most commonly used on teddy bears, but I just like this like added texture. It adds texture, but also since it dries so fast, the color will actually dry a little bit lighter, I think, than if you flooded with that color. So it can add some like variation to a set if you don't have a lot of colors, especially. And you'll see later I do that in a pumpkin set for that very reason. Okay, this I can tell is piping consistency. So this is my soft peak. The thicker the icing you use for bear technique, the more texture you'll have. So it just depends on your needs and preference for the set. And you want to use a damp brush. This is damp, not wet. Wet will not be good. A damp brush. And I just dunk it in water and then I wipe it off with a paper towel. And preferably something with like a rounded tip like this one. It would take forever if you had something with like a flat tip. I'm just adding my edible glitter in stages because this dries really fast since it's like very little icing. And you want to dab in an upward motion, so perpendicular to the cookie. You really want to make sure that the flood is like basically completely dry. I've certainly tempted fate and done this technique when the base is not totally dry, and sometimes I get away with it, and other times I crack a hole in the surface of the icing, which is always kind of like a bummer. But luckily this technique actually can hide that pretty easily if your hole is not too big. Yeah. I've just gotten really good at fixing my mistakes. All right, adding the last bit of edible glitter, and we done. You know, it's a nice little variation. All right, what are we doing next? Okay, I know what we're doing. So this was one of those where I was like, it's not necessary to outline in the correct colors, or I don't know. I just didn't feel like it. 99% sure. These are the ones we're covering in glitter. Glitter? Not glitter. Sugar. Sprinkles, Grace. So I figured it would be pretty covered anyway. You can see how you can see especially in that right side, how I really overlapped the edge of that yellow with the orange. Yay, yay, yay. With this set, I did 3 different sprinkles, and that is because one of my goals with the shape series sets that I do is to not only do fun stuff, but to decorate them in the most common ways possible so you can see how it's done. And candy corn is very common for Halloween. So I want to make sure that I'm doing all the basics as well as like fun and interesting things. So this here is white non-prize. I think everyone should have 3 kinds of sprinkles and edible glitter. So the 3 sprinkles are white non-prize, white sanding sugar in 2 sizes, which I'll show you after this one, in small and large, and then the white diamond dust. Those 4 like decorations are my most used. I rarely ever use anything else. And yeah, I just think if you're going to have sprinkles, those are the sprinkles to have. All right, so I did the same exact thing, outlined, flooded. This is still wet, and I'm starting with, okay, this is the large sanding sugar. Always do this over a bowl. You will thank me later. Always large. I'm always reusing my sprinkles, because they don't get like icing on them. I just knock off the excess. It's really important when you're covering an entire cookie in sanding sugar to not over flood it. And actually, I think I had issues with a couple of these and had to redo them. There was just a rogue non-pry in my sanding sugar. And then at this stage, while it's still wet, and it's all covered in sanding sugar, you can actually use your fingers or a scribe, whatever, to like press the icing back in just to encourage it to stay in place. And there we go. So that's the large sanding sugar, but I also had to show you what the small sanding sugar looks like. Something I have found, just FYI, with sanding sugar, if you cover the whole thing in sanding sugar, it doesn't dry totally completely, / it needs more time to dry. If I try to bag these too soon, like at the same time as everything else, I find that they can be a little too fragile. I guess it's because it's covered in sugar. I don't know. So give it a little extra time to dry, but I think these are the best to eat in my opinion because they don't completely harden like the rest of the icing. And sanding sugar is sugar, but it's like special sugar. So this is bigger than table sugar, this small size here. And then obviously the large is like much larger than table sugar. So you couldn't you could use table sugar, but it's too small, and it won't have, I don't understand how they get like the glisten sparkle with sanding sugar like this one. Yeah, I don't know. I just think it looks cool. It's a very simple technique. I'm pretty sure this one flooded over. I feel like it, yeah, because I'm like, there's just too much icing that just wants to flood over the edge. Whoops. Sorry. Alright, at some point I stopped messing with this. Let's see. We done? Yes, we are done. All right, so moving on to the next. Same deal. We have outlined with white, flooded. Everything is still wet, but I wanted to show you. So this is what we're going to add first. A little variation here because we're going to do a wet on wet design. So this is the first way. You can see here, especially when we get to the yellow, that wrinkling, it means that the icing has started to crust, which tells me I really did not use an extra thin flood here. If this was truly extra thin, then I wouldn't have gotten that wrinkling. You just have more time to work with it before it starts to crust. And this is a way to do this kind of pull technique where you just keep the scribe in the whole time. I kind of wish that I had just kept the, instead of bringing it all the way down to the top and the bottom, one way to have escaped some of those wrinkles was to keep it towards the center. So like just keeping the wave through the center of the cookie, if that makes sense, instead of like totally all the way up, all the way down. But again, I only do one of each cookie, so it's like, well, ship has sailed. It still looks good. It looks cool. And then the next cookie is a variation on this. So instead of doing the alternating, whatever I did before, white and yellow lines, we're doing black. And we are going to, let's see. We're going to do basically the same thing, sort of, as the previous one, except we're going to pull the scribe out every time and clean it off. This is just a different way to do it. It takes more time, which means that you're just spending more time with the icing. Now that I'm looking at this too, like I wish that I had not pulled the icing quite so far. I think it would have looked better if I had left the pulls shorter. Yeah. You live, you learn. Anyone does this after me, those are my notes. I always say, if I ever make this again, that's how I would change it. But because I'm a content creator, I'm always trying to do different things, and I try not to repeat myself. Well, okay, I say I try not to repeat myself, but I've repeated several techniques in this. Okay, there was a little bit of black in my pull, so I just fixed that by covering it up with some yellow icing, and because it was still wet, voila, no one knows. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah, I think it's beautiful. All right, moving on. What are we doing next? Okay, we started this one the same as the last one, but we're just going to do a different kind of pull. This is also a continuous pull, but it is reminiscent of that line work we did at the very beginning. Except instead of line work, we're just doing a scribe pull. How cool. I think it's pretty nifty. Niftylicious. I don't know why I just said that. Oh man, Grace. Voila. Give it a nice little taparoo. Help the icing settle. And there we go. It's interesting. It's different. All right. This one, we're starting off with yellow. And this is going to be, I think I'm going to show you 2 more wet on wet here. This was a pretty bright yellow. So I would imagine I think I have 3 yellows in my colors. Yeah, well, 3 gel colorings. All AmeriColor. I have lemon yellow, egg yellow, and electric yellow. Electric yellow is the brightest. Lemon is like the standard. And then egg yellow is a little like more like egg yolk-y yellow. This one, I'm guessing, is just like probably pure lemon yellow. Because I wanted a pretty bright yellow for this. Aha, we are not flooding the whole thing. Okay, so for this one, we're doing some pretty big sections of wet on wet. And for this, you want to do what I'm doing here. Instead of like flooding the whole thing in yellow and then covering the sections, the orange sections, and then what was going to be the center, I think, is white, that would just be way too much icing. So by doing it kind of in sections here, you're applying just the right amount of icing. Sorry, I just got mesmerized by my own icing. Okay, so that was all flood consistency. And then we're going to take our Scribe. This is one of my favorites from the set. It looks nothing like candy corn, but I don't care. It's just fun. And I love a good wet on wet Scribe pull situation. Ugh. It kind of reminds me of like a spider web, but then it also kind of reminds me of a flower. I don't know. It reminds me of all the things, I guess. So I usually do the lines going out first and then coming back in, primarily because it just makes sense to me, but also it's just smart. It's better because like you're pulling the icing out, but then it's better to finish by pulling the icing in. So you're encouraging the icing to come back into the center as opposed to like encouraging it out to the edge, which might end up in some overflood. It looks so cool. Right, so it starts off as kind of like a spider web and then ends as a flower. All right, this is started the exact same, but we're just going to do a different Scribe pull, and this is even wackier and even more does not look like whatever. It looks cool. That's all that matters. And I only do one of these, so I was like, ooh, let's try going back and forth. And this is what it ended up looking like. I love the like little curves on either side that you get from doing this like continuous Scribe pull. I think it looks really cool. There we go. Just going to use that Scribe to kind of jiggle the very top, help settle that down. Voila. Hey! Yay. I think that might be the last one. And that's the last one. All right. Well, I really enjoyed this format. I like to be able to talk through the whole thing. I run out of things to say when there's too much repetition. So hopefully you enjoyed this too. Let me know in the comments. And I do hope that you try some candy corn yourself because they're super cute, super fun, lots of accessible ideas. And that's all I got for today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Have a sweet one.